Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
The U.S. and China signed a trade deal that officials say will lead to a sharp increase in sales of U.S. goods and services to China, as reported by the Wall Street Journal. Further open Chinese markets to foreign firms, especially in financial services, and provide strong new protections for trade secrets and intellectual property. Why do you care? Well, you're going to find out why you care, because Lance and I are going to see if this thing lives up to its hype or not. And you should care about that a couple different ways. First and foremost, obviously it could have an effect on your pocketbook. I don't know if you've looked recently at all those products in your house, all those clothing items that you have, but a lot of them you'll find this little tag somewhere, this imprint that says made in China. So that's one of the big reasons you care. You could also care though, because whether or not our officials and what they're promising is what we're getting could inform your decision in the upcoming presidential election and congressional election and Senate elections. So all very important ways that you could care. But of course, we couldn't begin a conversation on our president's most recent trade deal without
your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Well, we're here to talk about China, folks. And as I've told you before, anytime China makes a deal, it's usually a good thing for China. So that doesn't mean it's not a good deal for the United States, but we usually don't see the Chinese sign off on something that doesn't benefit them. So let's get going.
So I think it's important to start right out with understanding, right, that it leaves in place this deal that they've reached, leaves in place U.S. tariffs on about $370 billion in Chinese goods, or about 3/4 of Chinese imports to the U.S. So while there are tariffs that have been lifted, right, Lance, this is not, this isn't the end. Or that's what we've been told.
Right. And some of the tariffs have been cut, but a quote from President Trump saying, quote, all the remaining tariffs will come off if the talks produce a second agreement. So this is a phase one agreement. This was, as you pointed out, give and take. Basically, a lot of what we asked for is not in it, but it is an initial agreement that the president hopes leads to a second agreement, which will be closer to what we wanted initially. So it's not the end all be all, but it is hopefully a step in the right direction.
Right. So part of as we're going through this, what you want to keep in mind is thinking about, okay, if there's going to be a second phase, what do we want changed about the first phase, or what's not in this that needs to be in the second phase? So the way this is going to work today is Lance and I are going to take you through 7 pieces, the 7 core pieces of this agreement. And then we're going to, in the last segment, so that'll be the first 2 segments. In the last segment, we're going to get into, is this a net positive or net negative for the United States? And then also, what do we want to see in the future, since this is supposed to not be the end? This
right.
is, as Lance said, this is a phase 1 deal. So that probably means there's a second phase or maybe even a third phase coming. What do we need to see in those future deals to make sure that they work in our favor? So without further ado, Lance, let's start right off with buying American. Okay. So this is all, again, in the Wall Street Journal article, which you can follow along with at thestateofus.org, thestateofus.org. Buying American. Beijing will ramp up purchases of U.S. goods and services by $200 billion over the next 2 years, using 2017 as a benchmark. So what do you think? That sounds good, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, it's
$200 billion.
It's better than the alternative,
which is to keep going with
which
this.
is none, right? Which is holding steady and not doing things. I think it's interesting to point out though that we're seeing the smallest growth in the agricultural products. Just to talk to those people out here in the Midwest where we are from, who had a rough summer. And yes, the harvest was better than anticipated, but it was still a pretty rough year for farmers in the Midwest with all of the rain and the weather not cooperating very much. And then throwing in the tariffs, that the smallest area of increased buying by the Chinese will come in the agricultural phase, not nearly as much as manufactured goods, energy, and the service industry.
Well, and speaking of agricultural products, that's actually the next major component. The agriculture purchases have smaller goals for increased trade under the deal than energy, manufacturing, and services. There's projected to be an increase of $32 billion. In addition to the purchase targets, however, China has agreed to steps that allow more market access for U.S. dairy products, poultry, beef, fish, rice, and even pet food. Now, the big one here, Lance, that sticks out to me is the poultry item.
Right.
Or excuse me, not the poultry item. Pork. They don't mention it by name.
Right.
Right. They mention poultry. They mention beef. They mention dairy, fish, rice, pet food. Right. We mentioned pet food, but nothing about pork. And we know that that's an area that we've talked about before that is often a sticking point. China wants more of it. And maybe is that being held out as a leverage point for the phase 2 deal?
Well, and again, as we get into this, we're going to talk about this isn't everything that both sides wanted. They both sides, I think, kind of came together and said, we need to sign something to ease the tension in the markets, to ease the tension. As the article points out as well, the Chinese are struggling at home. There are a lot of internal conflicts that are going on. And, it's pretty much, as quote here by a former Trump campaign spokesman, President Trump saw an opportunity to advance the U.S. positioning at a time when the Chinese are seeing great political and economic turbulence. So, again, it's one of those things, I guess, like you point out every once in a while, the Ronald Reagan theory. You can't get everything you want. So take 20 or 30% of what you want and then go back and try to get another 20 or 30% later. Kind of seems what President Trump did in this deal. You know, it's like you said, we're not talking about pork. We're not talking about the whole trade secrets, the whole intellectual property piece, not addressed like most people would like it to, but we have a deal. You know, I mean, we are, as you said, not to poo-poo it, $100 billion a year. I mean, not that it's going to happen in, $100 billion each year, but $200 billion over
2 years.
Over 2 years is nothing to sneeze at. I mean, that is a move. It is a move in the right direction, but I think you're right in pointing out there are a lot of pieces missing that a lot of us were looking for.
Yeah. Well, and that's I guess, it's good news because Lance and I live in an area where we think about farmers a lot. Not that you can't if you don't live in a rural area, but it's hard to ignore it when you live in an area like this. And I guess I'm a little disappointed that there isn't more there. And again, not that $32 billion isn't anything, but considering the agricultural industry and the way they've been hurting, it's not nearly as much as what we could do.
Well, and how much will, not to, cause since we're close to Iowa and the startup of the presidential election, how much of that will be hammered home by the Democrats? I'm not saying it's all a bad thing at all, but I'm just saying, hey, you helped us out. So you talked about helping out the farmers. Are they going to push the fact that you didn't help out the farmers as much as maybe they needed to? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and that's so if you look, there's actually, and
it's help, but is it enough help?
Right. Well, and that's remains to be seen possibly. We got to move on to the last one, which is trade secrets. And I think that's important. But the last thing here on agriculture, I would definitely encourage you to check out the online version of this article. And you know that we're usually big advocates for print, but they were able to include a chart in the online version that they don't have in the print version. And this one shows you planned purchases, the things that China agreed to increase as U.S. imports. And it does a nice job of illustrating that manufactured goods actually far outweighs agriculture. Energy and services also outweigh agriculture. So it's not that agriculture is not getting something, but it's definitely not getting, I think, as much as I'm sure the farming community would like to see it get. So trade secrets. The deal includes strong language related to preventing and punishing theft of trade secrets, which I think is excellent because this is an area that we've talked about before that's a big problem for us right now. Even more than some of this other stuff, I think that this may be one of the most important components. The article actually says, quote, "The agreement is structured as one between equals, but Beijing is making nearly all the changes in policy and purchases. The pact focuses heavily on U.S. complaints that the Chinese government and companies coerce U.S. ones into handing over their technology to their rivals, and Mr. Trump's focus on trying to close the vast trade deficit with China." This is something that we've heard a lot about in the news. It's something Lance and I have talked about before. And when you get into the specifics, it doesn't go as far as we'd like it to. But the fact that China is agreeing to entertain this, while they're not going to admit, right, that they've done this, it is an admission by saying that we're going to change the way that we handle this. And it actually says, the actual language in the deal says, "Neither party shall require or pressure persons to transfer technology to do business or to get regulatory approval," the agreement says. The deal also banned pressure formally or informally on companies to use a certain technology in order to get a given license. And you know that this is all geared, that's like 90% geared toward China, because a lot of those things aren't, I don't want to say they don't happen in the U.S., but right. You know what I mean? They're not a prevalent issue.
Well, I agree with you, and I don't want to be the negative person on this, but it also then states that in May, the draft agreement in May said, last May, obviously, but that they wanted these changes to be put in Chinese law. And that's not happening. And that's not happening. This is just a signed agreement. So while they both shook hands and said, "Hey, we agree to do this," it's not the hardcore changes that the United States was seeking, in that it was going to hold the Chinese liable through their own laws. So, yes, again, it is a step in the right direction, but it's not everything we were seeking, but that's what happens when you try to make a deal. You don't get everything you want. So we got something, but we didn't get as much as we were seeking earlier.
So there's more to talk about here for sure. We've got 4 more items that we want to hit in the second segment, and then we're going to get into, Lance and I will answer in the final segment of the show, whether or not we believe this is a net positive or net negative for the U.S. and where we go from here. So again, if you want to follow along with the article, thestateofus.org, thestateofus.org. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
An 8-part trade agreement, phase 1 of how many we don't know. There's $370 billion still in place of the Trump trade agreement with China. So we're obviously not done yet, right? Or at least the hope is that this isn't the very end deal, that there's more to come. So far, Lance and I have talked some about the first 3 provisions: buying American agricultural purchases and trade secrets. We're referencing an article from the Wall Street Journal. And if you want to follow along, you go to thestateofus.org. And at the bottom of the page, you'll see there's all these articles, and they'll have the corresponding title, Lance, of the episode that they're related to. So it's real easy for you to go on. And if you're listening to an episode, just find the matching title with the article, and then you can see what Lance and I are seeing. I also mentioned I really encourage people to look at the online version of this one, because there's an additional chart that I think is helpful for people to see that you can't see in the print edition.
As says the chart man.
Yes, as says the chart man. And this chart is also a graph, Lance. The one that we get online. Right. We talked about that before, right?
Graphs and charts. Charts and graphs.
It is both a chart and a graph.
Okay.
That's right.
Dual service. So the next provision, resolving business disputes. The deal calls for the creation of a dispute resolution office addressing long-standing complaints from the U.S. business community that their disagreements with Chinese partners haven't been fairly resolved. So this is a common, a U.S. firm, right, makes an allegation against China or something, or against another Chinese company. And typically what happens is it just falls by the wayside. China doesn't actually do anything about it. I think it seems good on the surface, but again, this is kind of like the last one, the trade secrets one. This doesn't change Chinese law. So part of the problem is the Chinese have some laws on the books
that they don't enforce against U.S. companies, or
That is true, right.
They don't enforce it when it helps a U.S. company. They enforce it when it helps a Chinese company. So this is one of those, I don't know if it can really help. I mean, it sounds nice, but how much power does this dispute resolution office has, or is it just a lip service? We've got this and it makes everybody feel better that there's a place to go. I don't know. Yeah. It sounds really critical of this component. I think it's a nice step, but I'm not sure that it'll lead to anything very tangible. Right.
It's, what kind of arbitration do you have? Is it binding or is it just, well, we're going to all sit down here and talk about it? And this sounds like something, well, I can go here and I can complain and I can, bang on the drum and get everybody's attention, but there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of teeth in it. But again, as the president of the United States said, this is only the phase one. Now, maybe phase two, we're going to push for a little more teeth. But at the same time, you don't want to give up the house, you don't want to give up the farm, to get certain things. So maybe what the Chinese were asking from us was too heavy of a price to pay to get it in Chinese law. So, again, not bad. I guess better than what we had. Not sure that it really is going to accomplish a whole lot.
So the next portion is financial services. The agreement also requires China to act quickly to accept applications from bank cards and payment systems seeking to access the Chinese market. And the deal's text cites MasterCard, Visa, and American Express by name. The U.S. had previously fought cases at the World Trade Organization to win access for U.S. payment providers, but China hasn't followed through with permitting access to the firms in all cases. The U.S. also pledged to continue to open its market to China's Union Pay system. The provisions of the deal are subject to an enforcement mechanism that calls for several rounds of consultations. If the two sides don't reach an agreement, the complaining party could take, quote, remedial measure in a proportionate way, which is trade lingo for reimposing tariffs. So this section here is kind of interesting because it's not one of those things. My guess is that most everyday Americans, if you haven't been to China, wouldn't really even know is a thing. And that's that it's difficult for our payment providers. And I mean, Visa, for example, is an international, major payment provider across the world. That a lot of these either have very limited access or no access at all in China. And you have to go through their payment systems. And that's one of those state mandated things that happens that shuts out competition.
Well, and as it's another quote here by a former trade negotiator in Beijing under Mr. Trump, there's a strong element of Yogi Berra's quip about deja vu all over again. The dispute resolution section will have the same problem we've always faced. That is, U.S. companies are reluctant to become the poster children for market access problems or discriminatory treatment. So it's like, what are we going to do here? Okay. I mean, are we actually going to push the issue here and make them decide this and let us get our stuff in and do this? Or are we going to sit back? I guess I don't want to get into segment 3, but that's where I'm wanting to go here.
Yeah.
It is interesting though, and I don't know if you want to comment on this or not, but one of the things in here that I found that I didn't see in the paper, that most people don't realize, who is the U.S.'s biggest trading partner? Who do we trade with more than anybody else?
My guess is that I think people would probably get it wrong.
Right.
Because I think people would go to China.
Right.
And it's not China.
It's always been Canada.
Right.
And the Chinese actually got ahead of Canada in about 2015, according to this graph or chart. I'm not sure which it is. It's a line graph, I think. But the Chinese have now fallen to third.
Is this the same article?
Since 2015. Yep. This is in the same article.
Oh, I see where you're at. Okay.
It is, the Canadians are back tied with Mexico and the Chinese are now third. So there has been some problems for China as well with this, which I think is important to point out, that President Trump did a good job of getting China to the trade table, to the negotiating table over trade, because the Chinese share of U.S. goods has gone down to where they were the top trading partner of the United States. But historically they were not. It was Canada by far. The Chinese since 2000 have been growing and growing and growing. And they had actually in 2015 passed Canada, but Canada is now ahead of them, as is Mexico. So the Chinese have dropped to third. So it's got to be hurting the Chinese financially as well.
And this is from a non-economist perspective. I'm saying this because I don't have the numbers to support it. I have not noticed a huge change in prices. I mean, nothing that's affected my life in a significantly negative way.
The things that you and I buy.
Right.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I'm sure the prices, and they haven't gone up enough that it's made me really notice. You know, I haven't gone to the store to buy something and been like, oh my gosh, look how much more this costs. My guess is that it's probably not the same in China. There's probably Chinese who are now don't have access to things, or there's things that cost a lot more that the everyday citizen has noticed the impact of the trade war. And I think that's part of, it's a reminder not only to us as Americans, but the world, that we are still number one in terms of economy, because we can go to a trade war like this. We can have $320 billion in tariffs. And for the most part, most Americans, they don't really.
In the short term, we didn't notice any major issues.
Yeah. So I guess my point there is, building off of yours, that this trade war has probably been significantly worse for China, which is part of why they're making some of these concessions. Because, and the other thing that you have to bring into play here, Lance, is the Hong Kong thing that's going on, right? I mean, you can't pretend like that's not part of the government's thinking. Is they can't have mainland China and the Chinese there starting to get, antsy with like, okay, we got this trade war going on. Things cost more. We're nervous about the possibility of another Tiananmen Square situation.
We're fighting a democracy push.
So, it's just, this is a way for them to appease and kind of tamp things down at home and give their people one less thing to be frustrated about, especially if they end up taking some kind of drastic action in Hong Kong, right? Which, we know that's certainly not out of the possibility. It's not like the Chinese haven't done that before. So, so I think, and that's part of what's complicated with trade, is it's not just because we have leverage over them. It's also what's happening to them outside of our sphere that's put them in a position where they're willing to do.
Well, and what else they're interested in, like you pointed out with Hong Kong. It's not to get off topic, but with the impeachment talks heating up, the whole concept of, is President Trump going to have more rallies in the United States, or is he going to go travel overseas? How is he going to
spend his time?
Fend off this whole impeachment thing? Well, are the Chinese trying, as you point out, counterbalance the problems they have in Hong Kong by going back to the people of China and saying, hey, look, we got a trade deal here. You're going to be able to get more goods now, and you're not going to pay as much for them.
Right.
So now you deflect, and then you go do something in Hong Kong, and people aren't going to be that upset because, hey, my pocketbook is better.
Right. It's not hurting me.
It's an interesting point, that maybe they're deflecting a little bit here.
Sure. Well, because even though the two things aren't directly related, if it's upsetting, if mainland Chinese people are upset because of the trade war, because things are more expensive, and then you add this thing that, while it doesn't have much of a direct impact on their life, gives them another reason to be upset at the government. As the government, and we know China is pretty skilled at controlling their people, they're probably looking at, we need to take something away.
Right.
Because if we're going to do something in Hong Kong, and that's kind of what I've been wondering, and maybe the trade war is the thing that's been holding it up. Why haven't they done something? Why are they letting this go on? Because it's not like them. This is, how long has it been going on now? Months, or a year, or
very
more.
Uncharacteristic.
They don't let stuff like that fester this long unless there's a reason, they don't just do it. So, the next thing, tariff relief. We spent a long time on financial services. This we've kind of already talked about, so I don't think there's a lot of conversation to be had. Prior to the deal, the U.S. agreed to cut the tariff rate to 7.5% from 15% for changes it had imposed on roughly $120 billion in Chinese products. The U.S. also held off on tariffs of 15% on roughly $156 billion in consumer products, including smartphones, that were set to take effect in December. The deal doesn't amend that prior agreement. So basically, we didn't make things worse.
Right.
There were planned tariffs coming that we had announced, and we decided not to do them as a result of the agreement. great, but
we're going to cut you some slack here.
Yeah. So that one's, I think, pretty straightforward. Currency manipulation. Okay. China commits not to devalue its currency or make persistent intervention in its currency market. China also commits to a schedule of regular disclosures of data regarding its foreign exchange holdings. This, next to the trade secrets, Lance, again, for me, might be the biggest provision.
I was going to say, this is pretty huge.
Yeah.
We're gonna lead into. We're gonna start the third one, or are we still going with this segment with this one?
Because we're gonna have to come back in the next one, because I think, much like the trade secrets, this is perhaps one of the most major components of the deal.
I agree.
And the thing that contributes to, is it a net negative or a net positive?
Yep.
Because some of the other things are kind of moot, or they're just not that big a deal. This one is somewhat substantial. So we've got more to talk about. We're going to answer the question, is this a net positive or a net negative? And we're going to break down what's going on with this currency manipulation thing. And is this a pretty substantial step or not? Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Buying American agricultural purchases, trade secrets, resolving business disputes, financial services, tariff relief. That's what we've covered so far about the trade deal. The question is the biggest component of this yet to have been discussed. Currency manipulation. China commits not to devalue its currency or make persistent intervention in its currency market. China also commits to a schedule of regular disclosures of data regarding its foreign exchange holdings. What do you think about this one, Lance?
Well, I would hope that it happens, because I think
that China follows through.
Right, because I think this is one of the biggest things, is that this is one way they can control prices and control trade, is that they don't follow all of the other economic data that everybody else does. Like the word says, they manipulate it.
Right.
They manipulate the money so that it makes it easier for them to buy, easier for their people to buy products and to keep their economy running. And they don't necessarily play the game by the same set of rules as everybody else. So for them, if this forces them to do that, then this is huge. Or at least gets them to play ball on a more level playing field with currency, then it's a great thing. I'm not so sure they will, because I'm not finding a lot of teeth in this part of the proposal. But if it does, it's huge, because this is probably other than the technology stuff, the biggest stumbling block in our economic relationship with China.
So the whole deal is governed by this enforcement clause that essentially, the way it sets it up is that if either side violates a provision of the deal, okay, then if the two sides can't reach an agreement about what the complaining party has brought up, then the side that's complaining can impose tariffs and the other side's not allowed to retaliate. So, I mean, but that's to say, this is how all trade deals are, so it's
sure.
It's kind of neither here nor there all of this is in part based on a good faith understanding. I guess I'm skeptical. I'm so glad this is in here, Lance, because I think, like you said, it's huge. It's really important, especially if it actually happens. But we know that even since joining the World Trade Organization, China has not followed the rules, like you said, that everybody else plays by. You
Right.
know, they regularly decide how they're going to set, their currency, and they intentionally do things with their currency to circumvent what's happening in their economy. And that's a problem, because it means that there's only so much that we can do, because we can put in place tariffs, but then they can do a lot to counteract those in their own markets.
Well, and both sides have an out here. And that's why I said I don't see a lot of teeth here, because it's like, oh, you can't do this, because if you do, then we can do this. But you can also pull out of the agreement if you want and do whatever you feel like. Right? I mean, so that's
right.
The way I read that it's like, we're going to hold your feet to the fire until you don't want to play anymore. And if you don't want to play anymore, then you can pull out and you can do whatever you feel like doing. Back to us. And I guess we've watched our president pull out of agreements that we had signed earlier under a different administration. And again, I'm not getting into that and saying that's good or bad, but if this allows for, well, you can do this to us and you can't retaliate unless, of course, you just renege on the whole deal, and then you can do it, and then you can do whatever you want.
Right.
Right. I mean, isn't that what it says?
Yeah.
And so, I don't know how really strong the teeth are there, but at least it's addressed. At least now, if something does happen, we can say, no, wait a minute. You're going back on what you said you do. And they have to at least admit, yes, we are.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? I mean, at least now
there's it's plain to the rest of the world that you had a deal and you didn't follow through.
Right.
So, I mean, China, there's definitely even if they don't follow through, even if they retaliate, even if they don't do what it says, right, there is it damages China's reputation when it goes to make deals with other countries.
It'll hurt them out in the world. I mean,
exactly.
Hopefully.
Yeah. I mean, the problem is, there's only a handful of countries that have the type of leverage that and nobody has the same type of leverage, but there's only a handful of countries that have enough leverage that damaging their relationship with China matters, because there's a lot of countries that China can damage the relationship all they want, and that country still has to do whatever China wants, right, because they just don't have they have no wiggle room, no negotiation.
They don't have the wherewithal to fight China. But I guess that's important for the United States. I mean, this is all about who is going to stay in power, right? And so if we can harm them in some way, if they should renege on this deal, then that's a benefit for us. So even though the teeth aren't sharp, they're at least, baby teeth. There's something there that we can use to make the Chinese look bad on the world stage.
So now we have to.
If it were to happen, I mean, maybe it won't happen. Maybe they won't manipulate the currency anymore, and everything's going to be hunky dory.
We're playing devil's advocate.
Now, let's go. I mean, maybe everything will be great.
It is possible that they're going to play by the rules. So at least these rules. I mean, they're not going to play by the rules
for the first time,
right? They're going to play by these rules, and that's the whole. I guess that's kind of the thing with all of this, right, that we've talked about before. They're going to play by the rules of this agreement as long as the rules of this agreement favor, as long as it's working for them. Right. I shouldn't say favor them, because I think it has more to do with we want something to favor us if it can, but we're more concerned with, are we okay with it right now? If we're getting hurt, are we okay with being hurt? And the minute that we're no longer okay with it, that's when we stop doing it, because that's what we do.
Can we being us or the Chinese, continue to achieve our goals and move forward under this agreement? If we both can, then we'll both do it. You know what I'm saying? I mean, that's the bottom line. As long as it's helping us achieve the goals that we have set for ourselves, for our governments, for our people, then I think both sides will stay with it. But that's not saying a whole lot. That's not like an earth-shattering comment, because that's what all deals are about.
That's how it works.
That's what all treaties are about.
Right.
Whether it's a trade agreement or a peace treaty or whatever it is, all sides always agree to obey it until it doesn't help them anymore.
Right. So the question, Lance, right? We told listeners we'd answer this.
Yes, I know it's coming.
But before we do, let's take
okay. I was ready with my answer.
Right?
All right. So before I answer, I'm going to talk about True Chat's mission.
Oh, okay.
Which is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. So you know that when you get my answer, that's what I'm trying to do. I think you can tell that I don't think this is a great, big, huge event. I know the president is going to try to make it really big, but I don't think it's as big as what we all want it to. I think if you look at the markets haven't just shot up crazily with this. So it's pretty much what everybody expected. But it's a deal. So there you go. I mean, having a deal is better than no deal, but it's not necessarily, I guess it's a net positive because it is a deal, and I'd rather have a deal than a trade war going on. But that's about as far as I'm going to go.
Understand that this is phase one, right? This is not supposed to be, this is it. Now, it may be because we may not be able to get another deal.
If it's phase only, then it's not a very strong deal.
Right. Yeah.
It's only going to become a strong deal if there's a phase 2. How's that for my opinion?
Yep. And so I think, as a first step, I think this is pretty good. This in and of itself, I think, is a net positive because it's a first step. And like Lance said, it's better than having a trade war. It's better than having all these tariffs in place. It's better than hurting, continuing to punish American organizations who, as a result, are feeling the effects of the trade war. So I think from that regard, it's definitely a net positive. At the same time, I think that from just an overall trade perspective, the only way that it stays a net positive is if we're able to build off of this. Because really a lot of these things aren't things that they're not super new things. We've tried them before with China. So the question is, can it continue? Can everybody play by the rules long enough to get a second phase in place? So I think that's what it comes down to. Net positive because it's a first step and it's moving in the right direction for sure. The big question is what's next.
But it's not the be all end all.
Right. And nobody should, and that's goes back to this kick I've been on for however long. Just because it's not the end all be all doesn't mean that if you're out there and you're a Trump supporter that you can't hold it up and say it's a good thing. Just like because Lance and I aren't a Trump supporter doesn't mean that we can't admit that this is a good step in the right direction. But it also means that you should be willing to say, yeah, it's not the greatest deal on earth.
Right. That's my point. I agree with you totally. But it can't be going around holding it up and saying, look, this is the best, the very, 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 very best deal we've ever had with China.
Right. Because it's not.
To phrase the president. Let's be honest. And as long as we're honest about it, I don't care.
Yeah.
I mean, good first step. We need to follow up. Let's go from there.
We'll see what happens. That's for sure. Let us know your thoughts. We do want to hear from you. You can go to thestateofus.org to check out. Well, there's actually, as Lance mentioned, another chart also in the article. So there's 3 different ones. So if you're a chart person like me, those visual learners, you want to check out the online article because they just have more space to do that stuff. So they included some additional references that I think are valuable to visualize the situation. So be sure to go to thestateofus.org and check out the article for yourself. We've also got, Lance, books linked there that have been on the show with us, the authors who have come on, and we've got a number of upcoming stuff.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yep. In addition to the list of the books, there's links there that take you right to where to buy them so you can be sure to get the right copy. So please do check that out. And Lance, speaking of the website, it's a great place to go if you're going to invite other people to join this conversation.
Thestateofus.org, right?
Thestateofus.org is a great place to start because it includes all those common ways to listen. This is a syndicated radio program and it's released as a podcast. So you can kind of listen whatever's most convenient for you. But what are a few of the ways that our listeners could invite others to tune in to it as a podcast?
Well, you have Stitcher, you have my personal favorite Spotify and Apple Podcast and anywhere else fine podcasts are found.
For The State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. Thestateofus.org.